Broadcasting from Detroit's Gas Corridor, it's the Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent.
And I'm Kerry Jr. II. Today on the show, a system under strain. From the skies above Detroit to the towers guiding the planes. How the shutdown is reshaping the people and the passengers behind every flight.
Then, across the country, candidates are winning by talking about something simple and urgent. The cost of living. We'll dig into how affordability became the message that moved voters.
Plus, Michigan's Pot for Potholes tax goes before a judge. Cannabis advocates say the state's fix for roads could break their businesses.
And Detroit's story, told through its people and its streets. Filmmaker Stephen McGee joins us to talk about what 2 decades behind the camera taught him about the Motor City.
From air traffic to city traffic, from policy to politics, we speak with the people at the center of it all. This is the Metro.
We begin in the air, where the view looks calm. But inside the control rooms below, the strain is growing. Across the U.S., cancellations have surged and delays are stretching into long waits. The Federal Aviation Administration has ordered major airports, including Detroit Metropolitan Wayne County Airport, to cut departures by up to 10% because there aren't enough certified controllers to manage full schedules safely. Now, this didn't start overnight. The nation's controller workforce has been shrinking for years. It's the result of retirements outpacing new hires, a long training pipeline, and waves of budget uncertainty. The recent shutdown has made everything worse. Hiring is frozen, classes have stopped, and experienced controllers are leaving faster than ever. Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy says the nation is now losing 15 to 20 controllers every day. The result is a system that's still running, but barely keeping pace. Fewer controllers are handling more planes, often with less rest and no pay. Travelers are seeing the fallout in cancellations and misconnections. So what are the cascading consequences of all this? Today, I'm joined by former air traffic controller Todd Urey. He spent 13 years in the job, including working in the Chicago Tower during 9/11. Todd, welcome back.
Well, good to be back, unfortunately, under these circumstances and on this topic, but glad to be with you.
Yeah, we're painting a dire picture here. I mean, it's been a month of no pay for air traffic controllers. Many have taken up second jobs. I don't even know how that's possible with their schedules, or they're calling in sick, or they're just retiring. Todd, what is a day at the office like for an air traffic controller when you're shorthanded in the tower?
Well, first, I worked at the Air Traffic Control Center, which is a great big radar room that works all of the traffic for a number of towers. It's airspace, but very familiar with O'Hare Tower and TRACON, the Terminal Radar Approach Control. As a matter of fact, I just flew in and out of O'Hare over the weekend. A typical day is you have kind of anticipated peaks, ebbs and flows of traffic moving in and out of various airports. There's always the variable dynamic of weather or other unforeseen issues that come up. You might lose a runway for some reason or other. An aircraft may land and then lose power and need to be towed. And so there's always this situational awareness that is part of the day-to-day. But for the most part, for the 45,000 or so operations that happen in U.S. airspace every day, it is somewhat routine, with always the sense that at any moment things can change rather quickly.
That situational awareness that you're talking about, Todd, I'm guessing that is very emotionally taxing and draining to be at that heightened level of alertness for how long are these shifts?
Well, most facilities, a typical 8-hour shift, depending on the staffing configuration recently, with many controllers having to work 6-day overtime shifts, that might change a bit. But what often happens, and was my experience during my time there, and my parents' experience, both of my parents retired as controllers from Chicago Center, so I grew up in an air traffic control family, is that when the peaks come, the adrenaline comes. When the ebbs come, you get a chance to kind of reset. And so it's kind of that very kind of choreographed day where, on a somewhat predictable schedule, you can anticipate when your flights are going to peak and when they're not, of course, unless something happens, and weather is typically the biggest unknown that happens day to day.
Todd, when we talk about flight cancellations, it can sometimes feel like just another headline about travel headaches for travelers, that is. But for those working behind the scenes, talk a little bit more about what really happens inside the air traffic system, particularly right now when we're seeing these system-wide cancellations.
So I'm glad you raised that question. So the system-wide cancellations are rather curious to me because they started with a 4% floor with an anticipated 1% increase every day. I listened to Secretary Duffy's press conferences yesterday, and he mentioned they had been looking at data. I don't know what data he was looking at, but typically what happens in the course of any shift, much less any day, is that there is a facility called the Command Center. It is actually outside of Washington, D.C. It is in the same building as Potomac Approach Control, which services the flights coming in and out of Reagan, BWI, and Dulles. That typically what happens is the command center is monitoring all of the flights nationally and is in a dynamic, routine, and ongoing conversation with different facilities. Typically, they happen with the changes of shifts to kind of understand, are there factors that were not in the recipe for that day that need to be considered? Staffing would be among them. And so based on what they get back real time, they determine, depending on which airports might be affected, which routes might be affected, is there a need to either slow down the system or possibly move airplane routes to areas that are not as stressed. It's a very, very intentional but real-time assessment. And so I've been concerned from the very beginning that we start with some number and then we say we know we're going to move 1% a day, because controllers don't take sick leave in advance. Typically, you would call in for sick leave just before your shift on the day of your shift. And so there's a lot of concern, not just on my part, but from others I've talked to, that this is part of the overall narrative of who gets the upper hand on reopening the government. The safety has not been compromised. I've not heard that until yesterday with the secretary saying he's seen a number of operational errors, but I've not seen the data. I've not seen the background to what those errors were or where they occurred. And so I would say to the flying public, I fly, and I fly without concern. One, because I know the system. Two, because I recognize that flight crews are well trained. And so with all of those things in mind, the one thing I have to bring with me is a sense of patience in the event that my flight might be canceled. My flight to Chicago tomorrow was canceled, already moved, but I've rescheduled it. And so I'll adjust my schedule accordingly until we get through whatever this is that the administration is saying it is.
So, Todd, if I'm hearing you right, you're saying that what Secretary Duffy is saying, you feel his numbers are dubious potentially, and that this is a political, I don't know, should I go as far as to say stunt, or at least political rhetoric in terms of how he is framing things when it comes to the state of aviation and the need to cancel flights?
What I will say to you is you should be very cautious with what the narrative is. Let's remember a few months ago, the issue was, and still is, that we don't have enough trainees in the system. We have an attrition problem that has lingered for many, many years. However, safety has not been compromised. Now, with this shutdown, because of the shutdown, a lot of these numbers of delays and cancellations are tied to the shutdown. Well, the shutdown happened October 1. The staffing issues predated that.
Right.
The issues with technology predated that. We talked about Newark over the summer. We've been talking about safety margins since the midair collision at Reagan in January. And so to present this now as some new thing, I have an air of, I think the word you used is suspicion, that sometimes when you're trying to change a narrative, you find a convenient foil. And the union can't push back because of obvious concerns about self-protecting as a public sector union. And so the narrative is whatever the administration says the narrative is. But what I'm seeing and what I'm experiencing, I'm a flyer and a former controller. I've been around air traffic control in my life more than anything else I've ever done, that I'm not hearing the dots being connected, and I don't see any data that backs up the narrative that I'm hearing.
I want to think a little bit deeper about something else that Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy is saying, and that is that between 15 and 20 air traffic controllers are retiring every day, up from about 4 before the shutdown. Does that sound like an accurate number to you? And if so, what does that number mean to you?
It depends is really the answer. There's a mandatory retirement age in air traffic of 56. So on your 56th birthday, you are no longer allowed by law that was passed in 1977 or so to control what we call live traffic, right? Actually talk to pilots on a frequency. And so depending on where the attrition is situated, where the birth dates are, what years were persons born, you might have that kind of retirement attrition, but it may not be because folks are just walking out of the door out of frustration. It is that there's mandatory retirement in air traffic control unless you request a waiver. And there are a number of controllers that are not going to request the waiver. One, because not all air traffic controls make the kind of pay that you might in, say, a Chicago or an Atlanta. Most of the controllers work in more moderate traffic environments, and the salary is not as high. And so when you get to be pension eligible, you leave and maybe explore where other opportunities are because you want to be able to get to a higher level of a quality of life or a standard of living. And so I'm not sure. I hear the number, but as I heard it, I ran the numbers. If that's 15 a day, every day, you would lose basically almost a half of the remaining air traffic control workforce if it were to carry out over 365 days. And so when the administration is numbers, my first question is, what is the source of those numbers so that we can really understand the summary that's being given, because we don't get the benefit of the analysis.
Right. Right. And then this brings up the question, if these numbers are accurate, are there enough new air traffic controllers starting their careers?
Well, the answer is no. Here's how we arrived at this. In 1981, Ronald Reagan fired PATCO controllers who went out on strike because Ronald Reagan, the candidate, had made some commitments to the controller union on his way and in his aspirations to become president. When he didn't follow through on those, the union walked out. My father was among them, so I remember this vividly. In totally decimating the air traffic control system, you had to rebuild from the ground up. It took about a decade and a half to fully replace that complement of air traffic controllers. But what that means is now you have coming up a decade and a half of attrition that should be somewhat predictable based on how many controllers actually made it all the way to full certification. Somewhere along the line, those numbers were not viable. In 96, President Clinton allowed some of the former PATCO controllers to return to work because we had a staffing issue then. I was still with the agency, and that's how my father came back to work, and we worked together for the rest of my abbreviated career. And so when we start looking at these numbers, it should be somewhat predictable. How many controllers that we lose to mandatory age retirement versus how many are actually leaving because of either the stress, the working conditions, or just the desire to explore some other career field. I'm not sure what those numbers mean because he throws them out, but they're irrational if we apply them to what the current state of the air traffic control workforce looks like.
In other words, there's a lot of context here. There's a lot of history that needs to be taken into account when we're throwing around numbers having to do with air traffic controllers. This has me thinking about how politics has worked its way so deeply into this conversation. And right now I'm thinking about President Trump and how he's criticized controllers this week who've missed shifts and offered bonuses to those who didn't. Todd, when politics reach that far into a safety critical job like air traffic control, what does it do to morale and teamwork?
That is a very profound question. When I heard the president's comments, it took me back literally to 1981. Telling controllers to get back to work. We just had a conversation before the shutdown that the staffing issues were a problem. They were stressing the controllers in the system. And so controllers who were already stressed, particularly after, we heard a lot of it after the mid-air collision at DCA, they were taking time off. And if they took time off because of trauma, that time off would be several days, according to the agreement, the bargaining unit agreement with the union. And so you got to get back to work. Well, let's look at what that looks like. I got to get back to work, but my pay's not been restored. I was working 6 days a week. You want me to show up for no money. I can't necessarily get to work because gas costs money, food costs money, and I'm already stressed. On one hand, the condition of the controllers was used as a boon to the administration to talk about rebuilding the air traffic control system. And now that same scenario is used as a foil to criticize the controllers for being too stressed out. That's where I think the contradictions lie in this discussion, because folks who don't know what air traffic control feels like, looks like, how it actually operates, are offering commentary and narrative about things that they just have no clue about.
Todd, you've seen the system under pressure before. You were working in Chicago during 9/11. What moments have stayed with you that show its resilience and a potential breaking point?
Actually, there are three things. When I was a kid, I would go to work, bring your kid to work day. I would go to work with my father. And I would get a chance to touch the equipment. This was not active equipment. It was not live, as you say it. So I could deal with the tactile functioning. That was the same equipment. So that was when I was a kid. This is pre-1981 because my father was fired in the strike. When I hired in 1989, that equipment was still there. So there's a technology lag that, for whatever reason, bureaucratic process cannot keep up with. The second thing is I remember 9/11 vividly for a couple of reasons. One, It was the only day that I ever remember that we had to literally sterilize the airspace. We were forcing commercial flights to land at airports that were not on their flight plan. And if they refused the instructions that the controllers were given, we were instructed to have fighter jets scramble to escort them to the airport. It was literally that serious because of the various unknowns about what was unfolding on the East Coast. And so, in that reality, I recall vividly, I was actually on position as the D side, the manual controller, as Air Force One had left off at Air Force Base in Omaha to get back to DC so President Bush could address the nation that night. And what was so profound is that the only airplanes in the sky by that time, it was the afternoon, were other military aircraft. And even other military aircraft who were operating pre-scheduled missions, we were told to move them out of the way of Air Force One as it went back to DC. It was a sign that this was such a profound disruption to the system that at some levels you couldn't trust anything or anyone, even if otherwise you would have known that they were actually on your team or your allies. It was really a different kind of alternate reality. And the skies were empty for several weeks after, with just fighter jets patrolling over major metropolitan areas in the country until we figured out how to bring the system back online.
Wow. You're describing quite a harrowing experience, and it's hard now to speed up to the present moment and think about how things are now in comparison to that anomalous moment. But I do want to try and end on this present situation that we're confronting. When you talk about recovery, you're not just talking about budgets or schedules. So, Todd, what would it take for the people inside this system to feel steady again, to believe that what they do is sustainable and supported?
Well, the first thing is acknowledgement. You know, there's nothing worse than working your butt off in anonymity, and you're working in an essential position in the middle of a government shutdown in an arena that actually has a direct impact on about 1.5 to 2% of global domestic production across the world, right? Not just in the U.S. So it's a big deal. Air traffic control is not some ancillary career field. But the second thing is if we're going to partner, let's partner. The hammer conversation from yesterday with the president saying, get your butts back to work, basically, something like that, really troubled me. And it troubled me to the degree that it might even build distrust within the air traffic control system of the administration that has promised that it's going to rebuild the system from the ground up, that they were going to get new equipment, they're going to get new facilities, all of those things, and they're going to do it within the 4-year term. We've heard nothing about what that plan is. We've heard nothing about what the training plan is. And you don't lose a seasoned controller today and replace them with a new hire tomorrow. The earliest that you're going to get someone even in a position to try is maybe 3 years. And what you get is a completion of training, but what you don't get is seasoning. And so we're losing seasoned controllers, well-trained controllers, walking out of the door by mandatory retirement that has not been looked at since the law was passed. And we now have an administration that has used that plight and the difficulties they're facing for political advantage, only to turn around and say to controllers who are still impacted by being overworked and in many instances underpaid, get back to work. I think it's an affront because we've watched the House be on recess for over a month. And when I was in school, recess lasted a period, not the entire school day. And so there is some hypocrisy in the dialogue that has not been called out yet. And the controllers inside the system shouldn't say anything and really can't say anything. but we got to call it what it is from the outside. Do not try to say that you need these folks 1 minute and then mistreat them the next minute. What it says is you lied in the first place.
Todd Yeary, former air traffic controller. Todd, thank you so much for joining me on the Metro.
Glad to be with you.
It's the Metro on WDET. The new 24% wholesale tax on marijuana in Michigan is being challenged in court. A dispensary owner and industry leader says the tax will be a small business killer. I ask him why next. Stay with us.